Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here and talk with you about my research. I think before I was kind of thinking I would talk a little bit about a lot of different projects that I'm working on, but it looks like I'll probably be coming back to Stanford in another month or so, and so I'm going to just focus a little bit more heavily today on a longitudinal study that we have with underrepresented students in college and higher education at a predominantly white institution. So I'm going to spend more time talking about that, and I'm kind of excited in that several of the meetings that I've had earlier today, I've realized that there's a lot of points of intersection in terms of the work that I'm doing and the work that many of you all are doing. So I'm shooting to spend about an hour talking to you about some of this work so that we should have plenty of time for Q&A. And during that time, I'd love to hear more about your thoughts or how you see any of this work intersecting with things that you're interested in and work that you're doing. I'm also, though, happy to talk about, I'll kind of, as I set you up in terms of the work that I do, I'm also happy to spend some time talking about or answering questions you might have about some of the other projects that we have going on in the lab. They all center around this broader construct of natural mentoring, and I'm always happy to kind of get into the details of why we're doing the different projects that we're doing and how they're all interrelated. All right. So I just want to start off by doing my acknowledgments before I get too far into this, because all the work that we're doing in the lab, I have a very strong team of postdocs, graduate students, and undergraduate students who have been working with me. We have the FAD lab, the Promoting Healthy Adolescent Development lab, and I also obviously want to acknowledge the study participants. We have a variety of studies going on, both, like I said, with college students, but also with members of the community. We're working in a lot of the local schools, so I just obviously want to acknowledge their involvement and the partnerships that we have, and then of course the funders for the various projects that we have going on. And I wanted to thank you all for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here to talk about the work that we're doing. All right, so as I mentioned, I'm going to give you a broader introduction to I talked to someone earlier today who was saying, well, why do you do this work? What is it that brought you to this work? How do you see it kind of fitting in to the field of education, for example? So I'm going to spend some time orienting you to that and kind of giving you my narrative in terms of how did I decide that this was meaningful work, and why am I asking the kinds of questions that I'm asking. And then, like I said, I'll talk about a couple different sets of findings that we have from a project with underrepresented students at a predominantly white institution. And then we'll do some concluding thoughts, but we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. All right. So in terms of natural mentoring relationships, I think it's just really important to have conceptual clarity at the outset. And I think it's interesting that no matter how many times I talk about this work, generally people still ask me questions about formal mentoring or role models. So I just want to make it really clear what natural mentoring is and what it's not. So when we think about mentoring more generally, we're thinking about a relationship between a young person and a more experienced adult, not a parent or person who's caregiving or raising them, but a different adult who they could go to for support, advice, help making important decisions. And a lot of times people think about mentoring and they think about big brothers, big sisters, these kind of formal organizations that provide a volunteer mentor. So what's distinct about what we're looking at here in terms of a natural mentor is that we're interested in the relationships that form organically through mutual selection from the young person and the adult. So it's not that a lot of this work is comparative per se, between formal mentors and informal mentors, but we do know if we just look broadly across the research on formal mentoring and informal mentoring that relationships, these informal mentoring relationships, tend to last much longer and have more frequent contact. And these are with people who, part of the reason for that is likely that these are people who are already embedded in young people's networks. So we're thinking about teachers and coaches and extended family members and neighbors, or people who they have a connection with maybe through a religious congregation. And so the idea that these are people who they've known, who they've connected with, who they've mutually selected into a relationship with, and on average, these are relationships that last for many years, all right? And I'll talk a little bit in a moment about how I'm interested in these kind of like critical transitions that young people are making, and so the idea that we might be interested in durability of the relationship will become a little bit more apparent at that point. All right, so just to orient you to my interest and kind of why we might be thinking about this research, I am interested in adolescents, and I'm thinking about that for many different reasons, but in part that we're interested in thinking about the ways in which adolescence as a developmental period provides a lot of opportunity for risk-taking, which to some extent we know is normative. But we also know that, especially for youth with marginalized identities, there can be a lot of negative, kind of life-altering consequences that can come with risk-taking, getting involved with sexual risk behavior or substance use. We also know there can be lots of consequences from academic disengagement, starting as early as the middle school years, and what that might mean for like high school dropout, or we know that dropping out of high school is a consequence for lifetime kind of earnings and health outcomes as well. So the other thing that we know that's happening during adolescence is that young people are engaging in this autonomy-seeking process. So their need to individuate or kind of establish themselves as separate from their parents becomes more of a thing than it was prior to the adolescent years. And we know that these young people are still having needs for relatedness and trying to figure out who they want to be, right? This identity searching process begins. And so young people might say, I love my parents, it's an important relationship, but I'm wanting to do something with my life. Maybe my parents didn't go to college and I want to go to college. Or maybe I want a certain kind of career that my parents don't have. I'm trying to envision what those possibilities might be for myself. And this is when adults other than parents start to become more salient. All right, so we know that young people are going to be more motivated to seek out these relationships. And also in other research, we've seen that young people will talk about some of the challenges that come with talking to parents. This is a comedic illustration of how it's challenging for young people to approach more sensitive topics with their parents. For example, around sexual risk behavior, or even to talk with their parents about risk-taking that their friends might be engaging in, because there could be consequences, right? Like a parent might decide they don't want their child hanging out with that person anymore, and they might impose a curfew as a response of finding out this information. So teens will talk about the challenges that can come with confiding in their parents, but they also realize that their peers oftentimes don't have any more knowledge or expertise than they do, right? So if the only choice I have for advice is my mom, who's going to end up getting in trouble by disclosing, or my friend who I know doesn't know any more about how to negotiate safe sex, for example, than I do, then I might be in a little bit of a bind. And so teens have talked about the ways in which these other adults can serve an important function, where they can have a peer-like or a friend-like quality, but they also know that this is a person who has the expertise that comes with being an adult. So these are all of the ways, at least from the adolescent framework, that I'm interested in thinking about why non-parental adults become more salient and might play a more important role during this kind of span, if we're thinking like 13 to 25, those years. Also, because of my interest in marginalized youth, I'm interested in thinking about the ways in which we can leverage pre-existing resources. And so, want to be sensitive, especially as a psychologist, to a kind of tradition that we have in working with marginalized populations, where we take a very deficit-oriented approach. And we often think about, achievement gaps, and we contextualize those to a very limited extent, and we just think more about what might be like the deficits, or how do we get one group to look more like another group. And so I've tried to be really sensitive to that in the work that I do, and take a strengths-based approach and say, this notion, yes, there might be higher rates of crime in more economically disadvantaged communities, but this notion that economically disadvantaged communities don't have positive adults is just not true, right? We now have several research studies showing that young people know and don't have trouble identifying positive adults in their community, in their schools, and their social service settings that they're engaging in. So my interest in thinking about non-parental adults is that these are a readily available resource to young people. Did the mic go out? Okay. You can still hear me? Okay. That they might be a readily accessible resource to young people. And so we should be thinking more about ways in which we could leverage those relationships as a way of fostering more positive outcomes among marginalized young people. And then, as I mentioned already, this interest in these key developmental transitions. So thinking more about how are we supporting young people through the middle school years or through the high school years, and then successfully transitioning into and through college if that's the approach that they take. All right, so some of my previous research that kind of led me up to the work that I'm going to present today, we had longitudinal projects with young people starting prior to high school and following them all the way through early 30s, so kind of like early adulthood. And we found that these, controlling for a lot of these individual specific factors, we were seeing that adolescents who reported having at least one of these natural mentors, so an adult who they could go to for support, guidance, and help making important decisions, who wasn't a parent or a caregiver, we were seeing that over time they were demonstrating lower levels of depressive and anxiety symptoms, that they were demonstrating fewer engagement in health risk behaviors such as sexual risk-taking and substance use. And we found that those trajectories existed even after accounting for support from parents and peers. So it seems that it's not just about young people being better able to solicit or receive support from others more generally. And we also had some research looking to see how this association between stressful experiences and then consequential psychological distress or depressive symptoms might be moderated by the presence of a natural mentor. So we found some support to suggest that one of the functions that these relationships might be playing for young people navigating adverse circumstances is that they're kind of helping with the stress buffering process, maybe helping young people expand their coping repertoire, or being a person who can help them to figure out kind of how to navigate some of the challenges that they're experiencing. But in terms of the things that we, still fairly nascent area of research, so we still have a lot of questions that we're investigating. And these are several of the ones that are really guiding pretty much all of the projects that we're engaging in the lab right now. So the first one has to do more with, so we have some sense that these relationships may be pretty important, maybe of consequence even for longer term outcomes and development over time, but we don't know as much about what's happening within the relationship, what are the processes that are making these beneficial, conferring benefits for young people. And we also don't know as much about what is it, are there specific either characteristics about the natural mentor or characteristics about the relationship in terms of duration or frequency of contact, or the role of the natural mentor and the nature of the relationship. How do those things moderate the extent to which those relationships might be beneficial, and also by better understanding what are the mechanisms that might be driving whether or not they're beneficial. Those are the things that are going to help us figure out how to better kind of refine and mobilize relationships that are going to be of consequence for young people. All right. So some of the other research that I'm not going to talk about today, we found that sometimes young people might say, yeah, I know this person or I have this relationship, but I don't really feel that close to them. And we found that when they report not feeling a relational bond, that these are not relationships that then end up being associated with any changes and outcomes for young people. So it does seem like there are some qualifiers. It's not just about presence or absence of the relationship. And then a couple other projects that, again, I'm not going to talk about, but we're trying to better understand. We understand that these relationships don't develop in a vacuum. So we're trying to think more about how family and school contexts, for example, may facilitate or inhibit their formation. So we're also acknowledging that there's a mutual selection, but that's happening within a space. I think a lot of the conversations I've been having with people today where we've been thinking about this in the higher ed context, what are the constraints, for example, on faculty and staff that might make us like less interested in trying to develop these relationships or less receptive to developing these relationships. And so that's a study that we have going on with African American teens in the broader Charlottesville area. It's a mixed methods project where we're really looking into that. And then we also have an intervention project in response to this third research question, where we are starting to think more, what are the things that we could be doing to intervene? And I am thinking about intervention both at the individual level, but also, again, at these like broader kind of system levels, like family systems and school systems. But how could we nudge along these relationships? And I just want to be clear that that's different from saying, we have a reason to think natural mentoring works, so let's go implement a bunch of formal mentoring programs. All right, I want to make sure I'm pointing out that's a distinction. And I was talking with someone earlier about a lot of the research on formal mentoring shows that even people who go through that screening process and who are very committed to that relationship, and they're just making a one-year commitment, we're seeing around 50 to 60% of these relationships terminating prematurely, like within 3 months. And possibly that being harmful for young people because they've gone through this whole process of getting matched, the relationship terminates. Sometimes it's not clear why it terminated, there's no closure. And so I just want to be clear to say, it's not about, the work I'm presenting today isn't really about comparing formal to informal mentoring, but I also want to make it clear that I don't think the implication of this work is that we need more formal mentoring programs. So one of the interventions that we're testing out is to see whether or not through like an after-school program-based intervention, we can nudge along natural mentoring relationships. So if the young people attend the intervention with an adult. These are young people who don't have natural mentors, and they attend the program with an adult who they think of positively, so they've still selected that adult. We didn't find a volunteer to attend with them. And then through a variety of activities where we're kind of socializing the young person and the adult to the potential role of that adult in supporting their development, are wondering if at the end of that program together, after a lot of kind of time working on things and practicing having conversations about difficult topics, if that might be something that then extends onward, which will give us a better chance. I'll talk about with the observational research, we do everything we can to try and isolate the associations that we're interested in, but this experiment will give us a better chance of kind of speaking to possible causality in terms of if we introduce a natural mentoring relationship that wasn't there before, is that going to be something that's going to have longer term consequence for young people? So again, I'll be happy to answer any questions about either of those projects or talk more with you about those at a later date. For today, I'm going to focus more on some of these questions about moderating and mediating factors, because like I said, there's a bit that we know, but there's still a lot that we don't know about the nature of these relationships and what makes them beneficial. So the project that I'm going to be talking about is the season study. I'll give you a few more details about it in just a moment, but it's a longitudinal study with about 340 students from underrepresented racial ethnic groups or first generation in their family to go to college, or economically disadvantaged, which we defined by being eligible for the full amount of the Pell Grant. And we were following them across their 4 years at the institution. A smaller percentage of we actually at UVA have a pretty high retention even across these different marginalized groups. So we did have about 20 to 30 students who didn't stay enrolled at UVA. Some of them did just transfer to other institutions. We kept them enrolled in the study, though. We still continued to follow them over time. And I probably don't need to spend as much time setting up the background and kind of the context for why we did this research, because these are probably things that a lot of you are pretty familiar with. But one of the issues in terms of inequality that we're focusing on is that we're seeing actually increases more recently in enrollment of some of these underrepresented groups in college, but we're seeing in some cases like the black-white achievement gap in terms of college completion has actually widened recently. So we're trying to pay attention to the fact that it's not about just getting to college, but we want to think about like what's happening in that college space that's leading to differential retention rates and academic success in that space. So these might be some statistics that you're familiar with. We have reason to think that being a first-generation college student is going to lead you to be much less likely to graduate relative to your continuing generation peers. We see this gap for Black and Latino students relative to white and Asian students. And then we also know that your family income, in terms of your family of origin, that your graduation rate is going to be affected by the likelihood of you graduating is going to be affected by your family income. So these are the kind of graduation rates that we're seeing based on the tier in which your family income falls. And so higher income students are graduating nearly at 75% relative to lower income students who are graduating less than a third. And then just to point out that this gap, a lot of times people will talk about academic preparedness as being a driving factor, and it's not to say that that's not a factor, not relevant at all, but this graph kind of shows that there's around a 40 to 50% gap in this chance of acquiring a 4-year degree by age of 24, and that exists kind of across the range of standardized test score. All right, so even for students who are scoring in the highest quarter for their standardized testing, which, to the extent that that's an appropriate indicator of academic preparedness, surely not the only one, but if we were saying it's all about just how prepared they are to be in the space, then we wouldn't expect to still see this gap in college completion among students from lower income backgrounds relative to students from higher income backgrounds. All right, and also as a psychologist and as a clinical psychologist, I definitely had a lot of clinical training and experiences in these kind of college counseling centers. So I'm acutely familiar with the ways in which psychological distress can be a real impediment in terms of learning and educational performance. And so we have reason to think that, and many of you are also probably familiar with this, we understand the ways in which this success that we've had in in treating mental health to the point where we have more students who are coming to college who might be experiencing psychological distress than we ever have in the past. We also know that experiencing psychological distress in this space can really get in the way of grades and retention within the institution. And we also have some reason to think that this might be contributing to some of the differential graduation rates that I was talking about. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. And again, that graph is just kind of showing it's among students who are seeking out psychological services. So it's not saying, this is representative of all students, but where we've seen kind of a plateau in the number of students who are seeking out services related to relationship-based issues, we're actually seeing more students who are coming in with issues related to depression or anxiety in these college counseling centers. All right, and then I want to just talk a little bit, when I was saying about the distinctive experiences that marginalized students might be having, or why this might be something that's undermining or playing a role in achievement gaps that I mentioned earlier, I think it has to do with a lot of the unique experiences that students of color and low income and first gen students are having in this space. So, just that the video is, it was a trailer that was used for a movie called Dear White People, but I think that was made into like a Netflix series, and maybe something of interest to you all. It's focused on the experiences, I think particularly of Black students at an elite, predominantly white private institution, and kind of what the unique challenges are that students are experiencing in that space. And I think the video clip does a good job of kind of talking about or acknowledging some of these research-based findings that we've had. I'm not going to talk as much about it today either, or at all about it really, except for now. In addition to this broader survey-based longitudinal study that we have, we also did, one of my students for her dissertation did in-depth, open-ended interviews with a subset of Black students from the broader project, and interviewed them about experiences that they were having with racial discrimination and the ways in which they may have been leveraging these natural mentoring relationships as supports, or kind of how they were leveraging these relationships even in preparation for bias that they would likely encounter during their time at the institution. And so some of the things that they had talked about even in that project were how even just underrepresentation in the space and the sense of onlyness, that was language that they used, and that's also a lot of Sean Harper's work out of UPenn has shown this as well, a phenomenon where students from marginalized groups, especially stigmatized groups, when there's only one of them in a classroom, right, or they're finding themselves repeatedly in these spaces where there's not others who look like them, become even more aware of negative stereotypes that are held about their group. I know, stereotype threat, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but this idea that there's ways in which just that process of being the only person that looks like yourself in a room or in a space, even for like women in STEM, so it can apply to a lot of different social identities, but that by being, our students at this institution as well are very aware of class-based differences. And so, they'll talk about how moving into their dorm room, and their suite mates are all talking about how much money they're going to invest in whatever decor and TV. And so kind of from the start, they're having to say, oh, I don't actually have the money to be able to do that. Or they're making plans for spring break trips, and the student's saying, I don't have the resources to be able to do that. So there's this way in which the signaling happens, and then students become more acutely aware of negative stereotypes that might be held about people from that racial or ethnic group, or people from that lower socioeconomic status. And so students are dealing with that. They're navigating, this kind of isolation or culture shock in the space. Obviously, you also saw examples of microaggressions when the instructor is talking about, he thinks he's giving his students a compliment by saying that they sound like a white student, and that's meant to be a compliment, right? And I think the problem our students, a lot of them that talked about these microaggressions, because microaggressions are a way of communicating something derogatory, some derogatory belief about one's marginalized status, but they can happen regardless of the intention, right? And so a lot of the students actually said, when someone engages with me this way and says something really offensive, but I know that that was not their intention, I know they weren't trying to make me feel bad, they actually feel less sure about like how to engage with it. It causes them, it's like more of a cognitive distraction, because they're spending a lot of time saying like, well, was that really offensive? Wasn't it? Did they mean it? If they didn't mean it, like how do I confront it, or how do I respond to it? So they're kind of, we were thinking in that paper that we worked on for that project about just how much of a like cognitive burden all of this work ends up being. And so we obviously had students experiencing explicit discrimination, and that was also distressing, but in a way, when they talked about all of the cognitive resources that they were allocating to these microaggressions, in the context of thinking about academic achievement, we really were wondering how much these might be undermining their ability to be academically successful in the space. And then, you see the example of asking the one black guy to be the student in all of the pictures to promote diversity. Students also talked about being asked to kind of like speak for their group in a class discussion, right? So we've had a lot of racially charged incidents in Charlottesville, and this has all been more recent, but even prior to that, over the past year, there have been lots of acts of bigotry on campus, and so if there's a class discussion being had, asking, the one Jewish student or the one black student, tell me more about what that was like for you, right? And speak for your group so that the rest of us can learn from it. And so students are spending a lot of cognitive energy and attention, and not wanting to be disrespectful to like a professor or even to a classmate, but not really feeling sure about like, how do I engage with them and let them know that what they did was like problematic and offensive? And also like, how can we have people doing this less often? All right, so on to this one particular study where we're now trying, so kind of that's the framing for why we were undertaking this broader study, to better understand what are the unique challenges that our underrepresented students are facing. But also we want to think about what are the ways in which students are leveraging resources that are available to them to be able to navigate and still be successful, at least academically, in this space. And obviously with my interest in natural mentoring, we have a lot of focus on that in this broader project. So we have reason to think that these natural mentoring relationships in some of my work and some other studies have been associated with greater educational attainment over time. So even some of the work I did looking at the presence or absence of these relationships in high school and how that predicted their educational attainment by 6 years post-high school. And we definitely saw some reason to think that these relationships might be playing a role in fostering advanced educational attainment. A broader study that used the adolescent health data set found that while students from underrepresented minority groups and low SES backgrounds were less likely to have these relationships than their white middle-class peers, they did find that these underrepresented minority and lower SES students benefited more from having these relationships in the context of the academic benefits. So they said they might serve a compensatory function even though they're less prevalent among these groups. And then there's also been some research, not much, but just thinking about the role of the durability of the relationship, especially during these critical transitions. So one study was looking at, among adolescent mothers, whether young women maintain these relationships during 2 years postpartum, and actually found that young women who did have a mentoring relationship both before delivering the baby and then 2 years postpartum were more likely to were 3 times actually more likely to be enrolled in school or to have graduated relative to those who didn't have these relationships. And importantly, that distinction was not the case for young women who had a relationship prior to delivering the baby but did not maintain that relationship 2 years postpartum. So some reason to think that this durability of the relationship over time, especially during these critical transitions, is of consequence. It's not just about having one at one particular time, but navigating a specific space. All right, so some of the hypotheses that we had for the first project that I'll talk about, the first study that we did, which was really interested in thinking about retention and academic, well, more generally academic success during the first year, because we, again, like I said, we're not really having a lot of retention issues at this institution. So instead we were focusing more on their academic success across that first year. And we expected that because we were asking students about as many as 5 of these relationships that they might be having, that having more of these relationships would be associated with better outcomes, that they'd be able to access more resources, more support, and benefit more from the support and feedback that the mentors were giving to them in the academic context. We also expected that if they increased the number of relationships that they had from the fall to the spring, that would be associated with better academic outcomes. And we also thought that that issue of durability that I just mentioned on the previous slide, that being able to have relationships that are maintained across that transition might be particularly important. And in this study, because I told you about the expected role of mental health or psychological distress in kind of facilitating academic success, we wanted to see whether this quantity of relationships that they had might be related to their academic performance via their psychological distress. All right, so here's just some descriptive information about, they did not have to be a member of all of those groups that I mentioned simultaneously in order to be eligible. So, the groups weren't mutually exclusive, but they did have to be a member of at least one of those groups. So about half of our students were first generation. About 27% had a family income below $45K. When we did another calculation, kind of looking at like income to needs ratio and factoring in family size, we do have over half of our sample that would fall in this kind of below a 1 in terms of income to needs ratio based on family size and family income. And then this is the racial and ethnic diversity of the sample, and you can see they were not non-traditional students in regards to their age. We didn't have a lot of students who had not gone directly into college after high school, so we had a very traditionally aged sample, and we had 68% women. And then here's just kind of like an overview of some of the primary mediators and outcomes that we were looking at. And so really just want to give you some context that, the measure that we used, the Beck Depressive Inventory, looking at both depression and anxiety symptoms, or the Beck Anxiety Inventory for the anxiety symptoms, the cutoff for mild depression is 20 on the BDI and is around 10 for mild anxiety on the BAI. And so we're seeing that within plus or minus 1 standard deviation, we do have definitely a chunk of students who are falling into that kind of mild range, and we even have a non-trivial amount of students who are falling more into that moderate space. So we're not doing this to diagnose them, but just to kind of get a sense of like how psychologically distressed are these students. On average, though, out of a 4-point GPA, we do see that our students are doing fairly well academically. All right, and then we did ask a lot. I'm not going to, we still have lots of analyses to conduct, but, we asked a lot of questions about these adults, these natural mentors. And we didn't call them natural mentors. I feel like that language of a mentor is like obviously very charged. It means different things to different people. So we just operationalized it for them. We asked them about an adult other than a parent or person who raised them, who they can go to for support, guidance, and help making important decisions. We also specified that it couldn't be like a romantic partner either, so really trying to think more about this mentoring relationship. We asked them lots of questions, I think I already mentioned, about who that person was, how they knew them, how long they had known them, what that person's racial ethnic background was, what that person's educational attainment was, how much time they spend together, so kind of frequency of contact. And then we asked a lot of questions about the different types of support that they might be getting for each of these adults. All right, and so this is just some information from that first year. We've just finished this spring collecting the 5th wave of data, which was from their 4th year. So we collected data in the fall and spring of their 1st year, and then in the spring of their 2nd year, spring of their 3rd year, and spring of their 4th year. So we're just now almost done cleaning that last wave of data, and we're probably going to be doing a lot more kind of growth curve modeling and looking at, one of my graduate students is going to be doing some regression discontinuity work for her dissertation with this data. At this point, just looking at these 2 time points from the fall to the spring of their 1st year of college, and this is just looking to see what the number of natural mentoring relationships that they report looks like. So the interesting thing, and this has been true now across all of the waves of the study, is that we have about 1/3 of the students who report not having any of these relationships at all. And that stays pretty constant across. So I think related to the other point I was saying about interventions, we're doing one now in the middle schools, but I'm eager to think more about interventions that we could be doing in the college setting, because we still have a pretty substantial chunk of young people who are reporting that they don't have these relationships. We did also see, just like the average trend, was that people who started off with more relationships coming in, more natural mentoring relationships, that we saw a drop from the fall to the spring. So we have more people reporting just 1 or 2 of these relationships in the spring than we did in the fall. Fewer people reporting, for example, that they had 6 or more of these relationships. And then in regards to what the role, or kind of how they knew that adult, we're definitely seeing that the biggest proportion, so because we asked them about that, and then we asked them specific questions about as many as 5 of these natural mentors. So that's where we have this information. So this isn't based on the participants, but it's based on the total number of mentors reported by each participant. So we had in the fall a total of 626. And then in the spring, we had 524 total. And so we see that the most popular category remained, and this has been true across multiple waves, that relatives and family friends were the biggest group. But we did see in the fall to spring a drop in the number of natural mentors who were former teachers or coaches from the high school, or extracurricular activity leaders. So we did see that people reported those as being natural mentors in the fall, but then not so much in the spring. And then we saw slight increases in professional included, like an employer. And then we had a slight increase as well in the faculty and staff affiliated with their institution that they were at. And then a very small number who reported like an older peer. The other thing that I was going to note is that so as I said, we didn't ask them, we didn't define for them natural or suggest that this couldn't be someone who they knew through a formal program. In fact, we even had that as an option that they could indicate that they had the mentor through a formal program. And out of all of those mentors, for all of the participants reported as many as 626, only 2 of the mentors who were identified were formal. So we dropped them from these analyses. I'm not going to be talking about that. But I do think, again, it's not that we're doing a comparison here. I just think it's important to understand that through all of the formal mentoring services and programs that are available, and even that we have at the institution, we're not seeing over time that students are saying, yeah, the person who I go to is my formal mentor through this program. And I do think that's an important piece of intervention, because I think a lot of the ways in which we've thought about intervening with students, especially underrepresented students in colleges, has been to assign them a formal mentor. And I think if students are not reporting that as being the adults who they're going to, then that's just an important piece of information. Then when we think about how to intervene, we might need to be thinking a little bit more broadly and not just thinking about these kind of formal or volunteer mentor programs. All right, so then to move on to some of the findings related to that indirect effect that I talked earlier about in terms of thinking about how the presence of natural mentors might be related to grades via changes in psychological distress. I'll just go ahead and say that we didn't find support. We tested 3 different approaches to this. One was whether or not it mattered how many they had when they started college. Another was just like total number of changes that they had from fall to spring. Did those go up? Did those go down? Did those stay the same? And then the other model that we checked was just retention, like how many of those mentors who they had in the fall did they retain into the spring? And the only significant findings that we had were around retention. So we found that the number of natural mentors that they retained from the fall to spring was actually related, and so this was their spring anxiety and depressive symptoms accounting for their fall anxiety and depressive symptoms. And we also found that their depressive symptoms were related to their GPA in the spring accounting for their GPA in the fall. And we also accounted for participants' race, gender, family income, age, extroversion, because we expected that students who were more extroverted would be more able to kind of cultivate these relationships more broadly, as well as their standardized test scores, which are associated with their GPAs in our sample. So yeah, we had some reason to think that this retention of these natural mentors during that first year, which is an important year for adjustment and adaptation to the new environment, might be important for their academic performance by possibly like mitigating some psychological distress that they were experiencing. So as I already mentioned, we kind of didn't go into this hypothesizing that would be the only significant finding, and I really wasn't even, to be honest, wasn't thinking about it that much this way at the outset of the study. But the finding that the total number that they started with, or just like total number of changes, the fact that those weren't significant, those analyses, suggest that there might actually really be something important about this durability piece, right? So if it's just about something specific to the individual, that's both leading them to have more of these natural mentoring relationships, but also leading them to have less psychological distress or better academic outcomes over time, then we would have probably had those significant effects for just the total number that they started with in the fall. Similarly, in terms of thinking about reverse causation, if it was just that students who became more depressed and more anxious were more likely to lose those natural mentoring relationships, right? Like if that's what was driving the changes, then we would have had significant findings in terms of just the total change in numbers that they had from the fall to the spring. But we didn't find support for either of those analyses, and so it seems like we're thinking about this possibility that keeping that same mentor who you started with in the fall through the spring might be of consequence for some of these outcomes. And that's consistent with the other project that I talked about in terms of that durability during those critical transitions. The other thing it made us think a little bit more about was that we saw the biggest drop in terms of the roles among former teachers and coaches and extracurricular activity leaders. So it just makes us wonder a little bit more about thinking about those as the adults who likely helped the young people to get into college, right? They might have been the ones who stepped in and helped them with their applications, might have played a pretty instrumental role in that process. And so it's possible that, these adults kind of see that as being the completion of their investment in the young person, right? Like, now it's time for me to just focus on the next group of high school students and kind of helping them get prepared for college. But there's some reason to think that those relationships that were key in terms of helping the young people get to college may also be important, remain important for young people as they're trying to navigate. These may also be some of the only adults that young people know who have experience with that space, right? Who know much about college. So reason to think that, that change in particular might be important as we think about maintaining those relationships during the first year. And then I'll also briefly talk to you about kind of an additional study that we looked at where now we wanted to think a little bit more, not just about numbers or retention, but look a little bit more at some of these support processes. And in particular, we were interested in thinking about appraisal support, which I'll define a little bit more for you in just a moment. And following students, now we utilize data from their first through their third year. And we're interested in thinking about the cumulative support that they would be getting across multiple relationships, right? So we wanted to not think about it as like an average level. We wanted to account for the fact that getting these kind of positive or affirming messages from multiple adults might yield greater benefits than just getting them from one individual. And we were also curious about whether or not the role of the individual, right, especially whether or not that individual was faculty or staff at their institution, might moderate the extent to which those affirming messages would matter for how students see themselves. So some of you, especially those of you with stronger psychology background, might be familiar with this idea of like Cooley's looking glass self. But we're really thinking about the ways in which valued others give us feedback, and then that is feedback that we can integrate into the way that we see ourselves. So this idea of like a social mirror, like I see myself more positively because of the way that this trusted other sees me and is communicating to me that they value me or see these strengths that I have. And we were thinking that this is probably particularly important among underrepresented students who might be having lots of other experiences in the space, communicating like devaluing messages to them based on their identity status. So as I said, not only that these messages from a trusted other can be integrated into like our own perceptions of our self-worth, but in particular when those messages are coming from someone who we see as having more credibility. So an affirming message about my potential, my academic potential from a professor or an academic advisor or dean might be of more consequence in terms of my global self-worth. All right, so here's an example of some of the items that we were asking to tap into this construct of appraisal support. How often in the past 30 days did this person let you know you did something well, expressed esteem or respect for a personal quality of yours? And like I mentioned already, we looked to sum that across all of the relationships that they had. We also measured their own perceptions of their self-worth, and we used the harder, so they kind of indicated how true one portion of this statement was for them. And then I already talked a little bit about the measures we used for depressive and anxiety symptoms. So really we're trying to see here if their psychological health is of consequence for their academic performance, what are the processes that are leading to kind of bolster their psychological well-being. And as I already mentioned, this is now looking at the second year of college. So the first two time points I presented to you were fall and spring of the first year. Still in their second year, we're seeing about a third of students who don't have any of these relationships. And then we're seeing somewhat of a distribution, even distribution across students reporting 1, 2, or 3, but much fewer students reporting 5 or more. We did see this change, so we're still seeing a lower number by the second year of college. We're still seeing a lower number of students reporting faculty or staff from their former high school, but we were seeing a more intense increase in faculty or staff at participants universities. So we're going to continue to look at this now across each of the time points to kind of see what those trajectories look like, but at least from the first year to the second year, it looks like they are forming more natural mentoring relationships with faculty and staff at their current institution, which is a positive thing. When we looked we looked at these categories to see if there were differences in just the average amount of appraisal support that they were getting by source. We found only we found a significant ANOVA, but what was the post hoc analyses indicated that what was driving that was actually just the difference between university faculty and staff relative to former faculty and staff from their high school. And that's probably a function of that wasn't like also controlling for just total contact that they were having, because we just asked those questions about frequency of receipt of these different types of support within the past 30 days. So it's probably a function of them just having more contact with faculty and staff as opposed to former teachers in high schools. But we didn't find these differences among any of the other groups. So it's interesting to think that they might be getting the same amount of affirmative feedback from faculty and staff relative to like their extended family or family friends. All right, so in these analyses, we were looking at their cumulative appraisal support in their end of their sophomore year and how that might be related to their perceptions of global self-worth, the sophomore year accounting for global self-worth during their freshman year, and then how that might map onto their depressive and anxiety symptoms the subsequent year, during their third year of college, accounting for their freshman year anxiety and depressive symptoms. We did find, again, we accounted for some of the same individual level factors, and we did find support for this indirect effect, both in terms of the depressive and anxiety symptoms via their possible changes in global self-worth. So as I already mentioned, as we're interpreting these findings, we're thinking in particular that this affirmative feedback from trusted adults, especially thinking about the challenges that these young people might be experiencing in terms of messages that devalue their worth or status. I know some people in here do work around belonging, and so I think in some ways this kind of relates to that concept about, I'm receiving messages that this isn't a place for me, that this isn't a place where people like me do well. And so getting that affirmative feedback from a trusted adult seems to be important, and natural mentors might be particularly well positioned to provide that. But I think it was interesting that we expected, so maybe I didn't mention it in the previous slide, we did these additional analyses where we looked at interaction effects in terms of the proportion of natural mentors who were faculty or staff at the institution to see if that might have moderated the effect of that cumulative appraisal support. And we didn't find support for those analyses. They were not significant. So it seems that the percent of academic mentors was not a moderator in this context. On the one hand, it suggests that maybe any natural mentor, any adult who the young person has identified as someone who they trust and go to for support and guidance is equally well positioned to provide this. At the same time, I think it is notable that those relationships were very new with faculty and staff. So it's kind of powerful for me to think about, even if I think about just my day-to-day work and interfacing with students, that words of encouragement, that providing this positive feedback on something that a student's working on might be just as much of consequence as getting that positive feedback from someone who they've known and trusted and who's been in their life for a very long time. So I think it does kind of speak to the potential here for even these newer relationships that don't have a long trajectory to be of consequence for underrepresented students. And so along those lines, just kind of wrapping up here and thinking about what some potential implications are of the work, I just wanted to give some examples of things that are being done at UVA, some programs that I've participated in as faculty, that I think are more consistent with this notion of how do we, at an institutional level, think about changing the space to invite more of these natural mentoring relationships, and that's different from saying we need more formal mentoring programs. So one initiative, and I'd love to hear about any initiatives or programs that you have here at Stanford. One of the programs that we have is called Mead Money. So every year faculty are given a different, like a version of a credit card that has money that we can spend at any of the academic dining facilities, but we have to take a student with us to use it. It's not meant to be used in any other capacity. So it's named after a former faculty member, and the idea is that we're supposed to be connecting with students in, again, a more of an informal way, right, taking them out to lunch. And it's an opportunity for us to think about our responsibility to students as not just being one of instructing in the classroom, but of trying to build these relationships outside of the classroom. So there's a picture of me taking a student to eat in the kind of faculty dining lounge one semester. We also have a program called USOR, which is focused specifically on low-income students, so students who are eligible for financial aid and who are engaging in work study. The university just recently started a program where those students can work in research labs as part of their work study, so not just the library or doing some kind of other task on campus that might not be as likely to lead them to be connected to others. And so there's some research to suggest that for underrepresented students, becoming more involved in research labs or other kinds of extracurricular activities can help facilitate that sense of belonging and connection, and play a role in retention. And so this idea that students would be completing, I've had several students in my lab already thus far who were getting paid, for work study, but spending that time as a part of my research team and building relationships with other undergraduate students, and y'all have the students over to my house. I think it's just a way of fostering connection and helping make sure, and some of these students are either in their first year at UVA, and they're also a freshman, and some of them are transfer students from community college, and we know those students also in particular can have a hard time integrating into the space, right? They're coming in their third year, they don't really know anybody, it's a different space for them. So that's another example, and then I'm sure you have, SERP is our just a IES-funded summer undergraduate research program where students from underrepresented racial and ethnic groups come and spend 2 months in the summer actively researching under our mentorship. So again, all of these as just examples of ways in which we're trying to intentionally reach out to students from underrepresented backgrounds and kind of create opportunities for connection with faculty. I talked about some colleagues' work with some of the students earlier in terms of it's called the Connected Scholars Program, and she's doing an intervention with high school students who are first-gen college before they go to college, just about how do you access social capital, because we know that these students are going to be less likely to feel, for example, entitled to utilize office hours. And I know we normally talk about entitlement in a bad way, but in this way, they're actually there for students to use them, right? For students to come and get extra help. And we know that underrepresented students are less likely to actually utilize those spaces. So, trying to think about all of these different ways in which we might intervene to foster these connections. And another point I was making, though, relates to just the evaluation structure for faculty, and that, we don't spend enough time probably thinking about how we could include informal interactions with students as part of what we're reviewed upon in our merit evaluations. And so that's another thing to think about as a way of thinking institutional change that could facilitate more of these informal connections that might be really important if we're thinking about kind of closing achievement gaps. All right, so kind of coming back to where I started in terms of my concluding thoughts, we really do have reason to think across now a variety of different projects that I'm working on, and also some research from other research labs, that these natural mentoring relationships are a low-cost and widely available resource. that we want to think more about how we can mobilize them, and especially think about what are the specifics of the interactions that are particularly helpful. And, you know, as I mentioned, not so much in this one particular study, but my broader frame of research, I think we're going to be most effective in changing the frequency of these and the extent to which young people are benefiting from them if we think about interventions that both change the context within which they're likely to form, but also increase the individual's motivation and desire to engage in these partnerships. And I will take any questions that you have and would love your feedback on any of the interventions or projects that you're working on that might be related.